This is Ed Driscoll for PJmedia.com, and we're talking with Evan Sayet, the television writer turned pundit, author, and speaker, whose latest book is The Kindergarden of Eden, How the Modern Liberal Thinks. It's currently available as an ebook for the affordable price of $4.99 and in dead tree form for $11.99, both from Evan's website, evansayet.com. That's EVANSAYET.com. And Evan, thanks for stopping by today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Good to talk to you again.
Evan, you've got quite a blurb at the top of your book. Quote, "With this book, the spot between Alan Bloom and Thomas Sowell has now been filled." Dwight Schultz, TRN Radio. Thomas Sowell and the late Alan Bloom, that's some pretty illustrious company to be in.
I got to tell you, the first 4 reviews that this book got, that was the first one that came in, and yeah, Alan Bloom and Thomas Sowell. The next 2 compared the book to Mark Levin's Liberty and Tyranny. So now that's, where could I possibly go from there? And I swear to you, the 4th one began, "Not since Gutenberg published the Bible." Now, shortly thereafter, the writer it copped to a bit of hyperbole, but only a bit. That's how excited he was about this book.
Now, you're telling the reader right up front that he's purchasing a work in progress. No matter what happens on Election Tuesday, it's obvious that conservatives, libertarians, Republicans aren't going away anytime soon. So why did you want to get an incomplete work in progress out before the election?
Well, I was torn the whole time between attempting to at least be a voice during the election season, to be at least a voice that's being discussed, have my thinking at least out there. But on the other hand, I didn't want the book to be seen as political, or he's only saying this to affect the election. So my instincts were to not publish the book until after the election so that it would be understood to be philosophical as opposed to political. But as I was turning to my colleagues, the people you turn to for editorial advice, they kept saying, "You've got to get this out there. It's got to be a voice." So I tried to find a happy medium, one that would make me happy, but at least would perhaps allow the conversation to begin before the election. And so what I do is I put out about a third of the book. I mean, we were trying to figure this out just before we went on air. Is it a third? Is it a half? It's somewhere between a third and a half of the final version of the book, but it has the main philosophical arguments.
The book begins with the laws of modern liberalism and their corollaries. Could you discuss some of these and how you arrived at them?
Well, how I arrived at them is an impossibility. It was just, it's going to sound so egotistical, and I don't mean it to be. And if you actually stay with me, folks, till I finish, you'll see it's the opposite of egotistical. But I feel a little bit like Moses. Why did God pick Moses? Moses was basically a stuttering wanderer. Why him of all people? I don't know why the original kernel of this idea popped into my head, not somebody else's. But it did. And it did because right after 9/11, because as you know, Ed, I was a liberal. I was a New York City-born liberal Jew, moved to Hollywood to be in showbiz. So if there's any place to be even more liberal than New York, it's here in Hollywood. And on 9/11, it wasn't even so much the attacks of 9/11. It was my liberal friends' response to the attacks. It was just a gut instinct that we must have done something to provoke it. And they kept talking, and they would give the most ludicrous argument. Well, back in the 1950s, we helped support a coup, and that's why they would give these insane arguments, always in an attempt to justify the evil that was visited upon us. And then the notion that the way to prevent further attacks was to be nicer to the terrorists. You know, if only we bow down to them, if only we reach out to them with an open hand instead of a clenched fist, if only, this just was insane to me. And for the first time in my life, I had to think to myself, how is it that the people I thought were the smart and good and decent people, the liberals, are not only siding with evil, but they're making the most ludicrous arguments on behalf of evil? And so that began me to try to understand how the modern liberal thinks. That kernel of the idea just popped into my head. I can't even take credit for it. It just it came to me, and as I spent more time thinking and studying and listening and debating and discussing, and yes, even reading those lesser writers like Thomas Sowell and Alan Bloom.
Those hacks.
Yeah, I just came to understand how the modern liberal thinks, and there are 4 laws and then 3 corollaries to those laws as they follow. The first law is that the indiscriminateness is a moral imperative. They will not engage their intellect to discriminate between right and wrong, good and evil, better and worse, truth and lies. Indiscriminateness is a moral imperative to them because its opposite is discrimination. That's actually the line that I took from Alan Bloom. And the reason that thinking is an act of discrimination is that anything that you believe in, or anything that I believe, or anything any person believes, is going to be so tainted by their personal bigotries. Bigotries we can't help but have. It's just part of the human condition. Things that I believe are going to be tainted by the fact that I'm white, that I'm Jewish, that my ancestry is from Russia, that I'm tall, that I'm short, that I'm fat, that I'm skinny, that I'm rich, that I'm poor. That anything a human being believes is going to be so tainted by their prejudices that the only way not to be a bigot is to never think at all.
And that kind of ties in with a quote you have in the book from the late historian Howard Zinn. Quote, "Objectivity is impossible and it is also undesirable. That is, if it were possible, it would be undesirable." Unquote. That sounds like some weapons-grade sophistry there. Could you explain what Zinn meant by this and how it's taken by his fans?
Yes, but the second question that needs to be asked is, what is it that makes it undesirable? You can understand why it would be or could be impossible. You can understand that argument. It's ludicrous. It doesn't hold water. But nonetheless, you can understand, okay, you can't be objective because you have so many of your own bigotries that objectivity is impossible. But why in the world would it be undesirable? And the answer is because if you have an agenda that is not related to the truth, then what you see, what you know, what you observe cannot be trusted because you don't want the truth to be known. Why doesn't Howard Zinn, by the way, Howard Zinn is the liberals' top historian. He's the author of the single most assigned text on American history in our schools. So if he admits that objectivity is undesirable, then A, how does he pick what it is he says is history in our books? And B, why does he find objectivity undesirable? What is his true agenda? That's what my book answers.
In your 2007 video at the Heritage Foundation, you called yourself a 913 Republican or a 913 conservative as a result of liberals saying that America had it coming to her on September 11th. Do you think that Barack Obama believes we had it coming to us on 9/11, as Reverend Wright said in no uncertain terms?
Right, that it's Reverend Wright says the chicken's coming home to roost. You know, it's hard to know what it is they believe and what it is they say they believe, because as I point out in the book, there are actually 2 types of modern liberals. There's the true believer, and there's the mindless foot soldier, and they will both say the same thing. You know, you go back to Zinn's quote, the mindless foot soldier is convinced that objectivity is impossible. The true believer is convinced that it's undesirable because it gets in the way of his utopian agenda. The modern liberal has to claim that 9/11 was provoked. Because if it wasn't provoked, then there's something wrong with the culture of Islam that they would massacre 3,000 people unprovoked. So because the liberal, the multiculturalist, those who will not discriminate between cultures, since they're not allowed to believe that there's something wrong with Islam, not only do they therefore have to prove that they were provoked, but one of the corollaries is that they have to raise the level of the evil they describe to the innocent to exactly the level of the evil that they're defending. Because if the provocation wasn't great, then the evil that they used to attack us would prove that they were evil. I don't know if I was as articulate and clear with that as I could have been. Can I try again?
Sure.
When the Islamists flew those airplanes into those buildings, it wouldn't be enough for the liberals to just say, well, Christians do some bad things, because that wouldn't justify wanton mass murder. So in order to justify the wanton mass murder, they have to portray the Americans as so evil that these lovely Muslims had no choice but to do it. So one of the corollaries is the modern liberal must ascribe to the innocent exactly the degree of evil that they're defending in the evildoers.
Now,
let me just give you one more example, which is, why does Jimmy Carter call Israel an apartheid state? Israel, this tiny, multicultural, secular, liberal democracy with a big dome towering over the Western Wall, and Muslims and Christians and Jews having equal. Why would he call the Jews an apartheid state? The reason is he has to find some way to justify the Palestinian terrorists who attacked the Jews. And he can't just say, well, the Jews, they're not really all that fair to the... He has to elevate the evil he describes to the innocent to the level of the evil that the modern liberal is invariably championing.
Evan, in your new book, you spend quite a bit of time exploring the backstory of liberalism, from Rousseau to Nietzsche, which sounds very much like a road to solipsism and or nihilism, or the Kindergarten of Eden, to put it another way.
Yeah, well, very much so. And I don't really spend a lot of time. I kind of touch upon the things that we know from the past. I really try to spend a lot of time post-World War II, because I think that the Holocaust laid the groundwork for sophistry. That here we were thousands and thousands of years after the Garden of Eden, or after man crawled out of the primordial ooze, if you prefer. And here we were, not only not advanced as far as living in peace, but here we are, we had the most horrific century, most horrific two wars in all of human history, and it left open the hope that maybe the answer is not to find the right things to believe, but to find nothing to believe in at all, because if you don't believe in anything, then you won't fight for anything. And if you don't fight for anything, then there won't be war. If there's no war, supposedly there wouldn't be poverty. And so the answer became suddenly not to seek to make ourselves better, but to wholly deny the existence of the better.
All of which sounds like a remarkably ill-advised philosophy to run a country upon, although it does certainly put a whole new spin on the notion that nothing is certain except death and taxes.
Well, the problem is that post-World War II, we still had the last of the great generations. Things really changed with their children, who were born into a world where you could actually be an idiot and survive, because there was so much. First of all of the things that required you to think in order to avoid horror were wiped off the earth just prior to the world's birth. Prior to, let's say, my birth, 1960. You had to be smart in order to avoid disease. You had to be smart in order to avoid hunger. You had to be smart in order to avoid physical pain. But by the 1960s, all those things science had eradicated. I point out in the book, disease. Just prior to my birth and all the way back to the dawn of time, people had to worry about things like smallpox, chickenpox, the measles, the flu had wiped out 2/3 of the continent. By the time I was born, polio was gone. The flu was a 3-day paid vacation where you watched a giant screen TV and you're lazy boy. And so long as there were enough people still doing things and making things and producing things, the rest of the country could live like children in kindergarten.
Some of your comments in the Kindergarten of Eden about Bruce Springsteen, Rosie O'Donnell, and other famous Hollywood leftists are certainly going to dramatically cut down on your cocktail party invitations.
Well, my cocktail party invitations have already dried up anyway. But the truth is that I'm better off this way. I have so much more happiness and sense of purpose and reason for living, fighting this fight from our side than going every day to write jokes for Bill Maher. There's really not a lot of solace and emotional strength to be taken from writing stupid jokes for stupid people. So yeah, I don't go to as many cocktail parties, but my circle of friends are a lot deeper and a lot smarter and a lot nicer than they ever were.
I realize we could devote a whole podcast to this question, but in a nutshell, why does the Hollywood left, many of whom are actors and comedians such as Bill Maher, whom you just mentioned, all of whom need to have words put into their mouths by writers like yourself, believe that they know what's best for the rest of America?
It's the idea that you were born. I'm struggling for words now, so I don't know how far back I have to go into the explanation to make sense here. But in the modern liberal era, you were taught that you were perfect from the day you were born. That all you ever really need to know, you learned in kindergarten. That you just be yourself and you are good. So children in the modern liberal era, with the whole self-esteem progress, they would go through school believing they were God, believing they were the smartest people who ever lived and the most moral people who ever lived. And most of us grew out of that when we entered the real world. But what happens in showbiz is you never enter the real world. You never actually do anything or make anything. You don't have to be smart. All you have to do is be clever. And there's a big difference between smart and clever. And so you get a guy like Springsteen, for example, who's never had a job, never worked a day in his life, never struggled. All he's ever done is quite literally play the guitar, play concerts. And now he has all this money, he has all these circumstances, all these people, and so the same ego and narcissism that you had as a child and that was built up by these incessant programs of unmerited self-esteem that came about in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, so that most of us, we enter the real world, we hit some hard times, we question our beliefs and values, we grow, we change, we improve. But those who have made their fortune, never once having actually entered the real world, just believe this reinforces their ego. And so they are as self-assured and cocky as the know-it-all 12-year-old.
And Evan, last question. How do you see modern leftism shaping out after the election in November, no matter who wins?
Well, there's good news and there's bad news. The bad news is that each successive generation is getting more mired in this because the counterbalance, which was the last of the great generations, has passed not only from power and influence, but is passing from this earth. So now you've got generations of children who are raised by the modern liberals in the schools, raised by the modern liberals by watching the television programs and their music stars. Conversely, there's the rest of us who at least have finally come to recognize this is war. That the values of the modern liberal, and that's an oxymoron because the modern liberal has no values, and that can have no values, because values by definition require them to acknowledge the existence of the better. But at least our side is finally stepping up, just think of Andrew Breitbart, and recognizing this is war. This is the left trying to destroy all of the values that have led us from the Garden of Eden through all the travails and all the horrors to arrive in America in the modern liberal era where there is no disease, where there is no poverty by any historic standard, where if you find $1 in the street, you can go get a 3-course gourmet meal prepared by a world-class chef at a place called the 99-cent only store. So it's at least we're fighting the fight, and how it turns out, I cannot tell you. I wake up on alternate days terrified, and then on the next day confident as hell. And I suspect that's the way it's going to be for a while to come.
This is Ed Driscoll for PJmedia.com, and we've been speaking with Evan Sayet about his new book, The Kindergarten of Eden, How the Modern Liberal Thinks. It's available as a $4.99 ebook and in print for $11.99, both from Evan's website, evansayet.com, www.evansayet.com. And Evan, thank you once again for talking with us today.
And always a pleasure. Thank you.